Cisco IOS Basics. As with any tool, the more comfortable you are with its purpose and how to use it, the more capable it becomes. The goal of this nugget is to allow for maximum capability by increasing your comfort level with the Cisco IOS. In this nugget, we're going to start out by defining exactly what the Internetwork operating system is. Then we will take a look at the user interface options available and talk about their differences. Following that, we will identify the different connectivity options that are available. And once we're connected, we're going to cover the possible shortcuts used in the user interface, as well as the help and the editing functions. The Cisco IOS is a proprietary operating system, and you can kind of get that from the name. It's the Internetwork operating system. Now be careful, because in some literature it will be termed as the Internetworking operating system, but indeed they are one and the same. Now within the definition, I did mention that the iOS is proprietary. Now under normal circumstances, when you have proprietary software versus standards-based software, then the option of choice would be the standards-based. And the reason for that is because you could have compatibility between vendors. In other words, if you had a Cisco router here and some other type of router here, then they would work together. But keep in mind, we're talking about an operating system. And so because of that, we don't need this software to operate on a third-party device. We simply want it to be configurable and operational within a Cisco device. So this doesn't pose a problem. But let's say that it did. The iOS is built on over 200 standards. You've got to understand that within the industry of routing, Cisco has been a key player for many years, and in fact, they develop and introduce many of the standards that are out there today. Luckily for us, Cisco's development of routing and routing protocols has gone on for many years. In fact, we've gone from first-generation routers who could accept packets and then forward those packets, and that was the extent of their operation, to devices now that can classify and prioritize packets. At the same time, they support advanced routing protocols like OSPF, which is an example of a link state protocol, IGRP for distance vector, and they also support almost every major protocol, and that is the routed protocols that are out there. So that includes TCP/IP, that would include Novell and NetWare, which would be part of IPX, and it also includes Banyan Vines. Anything that you can think of that needs to be routed is probably supported within the iOS. But the most amazing thing about the iOS is the fact that through all these changes and these advancements, it still maintains the same look and feel for the user interface. So in other words, I can be working with a version that is long outdated. Let's say we're working with version 10 of a Cisco iOS, and the command structure and the different levels of operation within the iOS are exactly the same as the latest version. So let's say we have a router that's working on version 12 and one on 10. I will simply have some additional functionality here within version 12, but the same look and feel and the same platform. I'm sure you can appreciate the cost savings in administrative training for the personnel, because once you're used to a specific look and feel of the operating system, no matter what advancements take place within the iOS, you're fine. It's not a matter of, as it is with normal change, that everybody starts back at zero. And that's why most people are resistant to change. Here you can add advanced features and not have that feeling within your administrative personnel. The iOS versions, as they're released, run through a life cycle. And within that life cycle, there are three main categories of release. And here we see them. First, the early deployment, then the major release, and then the general deployment. As you see these indicated within the Cisco website, they're going to be abbreviated as ED, MR, pretty simple, right? And then GD for general deployment. So let's discuss the differences in each type. Let's start with early deployment. These deployments are designed to address specific customer or business needs. Let me give you an example. Let's say that the latest thing to come out, okay, let's move back in time. Before IPsec was available, as it first came onto the market, let's say they wanted to add that to a current version. They would take the current version number, and then they would say, okay, we have a bunch of patches and availability within this version. Let's add IPsec capability, and what we're going to do is we're going to design it as an early deployment. So Cisco throws a caveat out with that early deployment. It says, you know what? Only use this in specific instances and take great care in that environment. So this isn't designed for anybody to use. This is when you balance the fact or the need for a specific function against the risk of deploying a possibly unstable, for sure untested version of the iOS. Now, when I say untested, I don't mean that they just compile this and then throw it out that afternoon. They do go through some testing, not to the regular standards that Cisco would run their iOS versions through as far as testing. That's going to be done in the major releases. What's done in a major release is, let's say that we had version 10 iOS software out there, and then you also had version 10.1, 10.2, patches as well. All of these different updates and functionality are going to be combined into one version. It'll be introduced as a major release, and let's say version 11 for the sake of our example. It'll go through testing, it'll be combined, and that testing will be tested with the idea that we're really looking for a very stable product. When Cisco releases a major release, they are saying, in essence, we believe that this is very stable, and you can trust it. Now, the sign of any great company is customer involvement in the things that they produce, and that's what this next step is designed to do. At this point, major release, Cisco is saying this is baked and ready. We're sending it out there. General deployment means that there has been extensive market exposure, and at the same time, a lot of customer sat surveys coming back into Cisco from the customer environment and the community saying, yeah, you know what, you were right, this is ready. So in other words, Cisco isn't just going to say, take our word for it. They're going to say, when you have tested it yourselves and the community as a whole believes it's ready, we're going to tag it as ready for general deployment. All the available information concerning the capabilities of the iOS and its life cycle are well beyond the CCNA scope. We simply scratch the surface here and want to give you a good familiarity. But there is a website that I'm going to give you where you can find pointers to or even the specific information that you'll be looking for. And that's www.cisco.com/public/support/TAC, which is the Technical Assistance Center, /home.html. Don't forget the S in there or you won't get to the website. The front end of a piece of software that's used by an administrator to make different configuration changes and also monitor a particular device is known as the user interface. Now, in most devices, you have a couple of choices on a user interface. Standard, you would have a CLI, which is a command line interface, and then you also would have a GUI, which is a graphical user interface. This is what you're used to seeing in a Windows environment. So with the Cisco devices, and specifically in the iOS, you are going to have a command line interface. The closest thing we get to a GUI is a menu interface that you might see, or you will see, on some of the switches in this product line. In the world of networking, supporters for each of these two types of interfaces are usually pretty well separated. You have people that love the GUI that say, you know, the ease and the intuitiveness of this interface is what makes it valuable. In other words, it's fast because I can simply understand this interface much better. Where the command line interface is going to give you a prompt, and at that prompt, you need to know exactly what to type in the syntax and everything, as well as the purpose of the command in order to get that operation to take place. But supporters of the CLI will say, I can support many different commands from that same prompt consecutively, and so it's much faster than a GUI because I don't have to go between different screens to make the changes that I want to make effective. My personal preference leans towards the CLI because I do agree that once you understand the syntax and the command structure, that this is much faster and much more effective. Now, hopefully you will agree as well, and in fact, if your worry is that you're not going to be familiar with the syntax or the command structures, that's exactly why you're watching these videos, so you'll be fine as soon as we're done. All right, let's move on to the exec session. This is a name given by Cisco to the act of accessing the Cisco IOS, the operating system, via the CLI, the command line interface. And then within that operating system, you need to understand that there are two levels of permission. And the first one we're going to have here is the user, and then above that, we have a privilege level. Now, within the user level, you can think of that as going to a concert and watching the concert. And in the privilege level is your backstage pass. So you're actually interacting with the concert and making a difference there. And it's a much different experience than you would have at the user level. Bringing that analogy back into our router, at the user level, you have access to the basic show commands, and these are used for monitoring, and also the ping command. It's going to be used to test connectivity between devices, like a router here and a router here uses this ping command to test the path between them. Now, the privilege mode, you have access to all commands. And within that privilege mode, it's going to include what's known as the configuration mode. And in that configuration mode is where you can make changes to the structure of this iOS within the router. Keeping track of which exec level you're in is made easy by the Cisco IOS by using different prompts at each level. Within the user level, you're going to have a right-facing arrow that that little prompt there. And within the privilege mode, you're going to have the number sign. So in other words, you're going to have a host name preceding this, and then the prompt. So if your host name to your router was R1, this is what you would see at the two different levels. So far, we've talked about the fact that there are two levels, and we've also talked about how to recognize the two levels, but we haven't talked about why we have two levels. So let's talk about the advantage. You're going to have different types of administrators out there that need to interact with your router. You're going to have some level of administration that simply needs to come in and use the show commands to monitor the device and make sure it's functioning properly, and maybe even test connectivity, but they're not at the level that you want them changing the configuration, because that one router can affect the entire network that it's in with one configuration, especially when you're talking about routing protocols, which we're going to cover in a later nugget. So that level of trust has to be assigned to a small number of people. So you can give a password out for this level, the user level, and keep the password different for the privilege level, and you can keep that information safe. So let's talk about the commands used to get between the two levels. As soon as you get into a router or try to log in, it has the option of asking you for a password. Once that first password is provided, you will be in what is known as the user exec level. If you want to move from that level, from the show commands, into the ability to change configuration, you're going to type in the command enable, because you're going to enable yourself to make those changes. Makes sense, right? Once you do that, you will be prompted for a password again. Again, this is optional, but always recommended. The password is provided correctly, you are now in the privilege level. Once there, you can make any changes you want and see everything within the router. If for any reason you want to move from the privilege exec to the user exec mode, you simply type in the command disable. Makes sense, right? With the enable getting you where you need to be, the disable takes you back. Now take care here, because if you type in the exit command at the privilege level, it's not going to take you back one step. As you might assume, it's going to take you out of your exec session completely. And remember, your exec session is defined as your access into the iOS via the CLI. So in other words, you're going to be out of the router if you type this command at that prompt. So to go back, use the disable. Now let's put all of this together on our router in a live session. Here you see my router in waiting. I hit enter. The first thing it's going to do is give me the prompt. As indicated by that right-facing arrow, I am in the user exec mode. Remember I told you, let me scoot back here for a second and make this much smaller. At this level, we could have been asked for or prompted for a password, and that is recommended. And we're going to make changes so that we are asked for a password as soon as we get into the correct level, which is the privilege mode. So let's move from here with the enable command. And now we're prompted for a password. Type it in. Now the router prompt changes. You see the number sign now. Lets you know you're in privilege mode. We talked about the configuration mode being accessible from here. We're going to go into configure via, and it's going to give you a choice, but we're going to type terminal at this point. So we're configuring via terminal. And once we do that, you see that our prompt changed yet again. We still keep the number sign to say that we're in the privilege exec mode, but we're in the configuration mode as well. In this mode, we can define different lines. So I'm going to go into line console 0. Now, don't worry that you don't know what these lines are, because we're going to cover it in the next section for connectivity of this nugget. But for now, I just want to get you familiar with the configure mode. So once I'm in that line, I can type in the command password 0 and then the password Cisco. Then I'm going to set a password for that line. But keep in mind, this isn't the only command I need for that password to be effective. I also need the command login, and this is what is going to let this line console know that it needs to ask for a password. Control Z is going to end this session as indicated here. End with Control Z. Once I've done that, I can exit. And the reason I can exit here instead of disable is because I want to get completely out of the router. Remember, the changes we made were in the introduction to our user exec level. So simply a disable command would only take me back to the prompt of the user exec. I couldn't test the password to get there. All right, so here we are. Let's hit enter again. First thing we get is a password, so it's taken effect. I type in Cisco. Now I'm at the user exec. Type in enable. And now I'm at the privilege level once I type in my password, as indicated by the prompt. Type in disable, and I can go back one step rather than the exit command taking me completely out of the router. So let me draw this out one more time to make sure it's clear. As I enter my iOS device, I enter into the user exec mode. I can advance to a privilege exec mode by the use of the enable command. Within the privilege exec, I have advanced show commands that I can use on the router that weren't in the user exec, and I also have the ability to get into the configuration mode. Earlier, I defined an exec session as accessing the iOS on the device. This access here is going to be divided into 3 different ways of access or connectivity. And the first is going to be console, then auxiliary, and then the virtual terminals. So let me define each of these for you if I could. This is going to be a depiction of the back of a router, just some typical router. First of all, the console. The console port will exist on the back of the router, and it can be in the form of an RJ45 connector or the larger connectors, the DB25. Either way, it is going to be labeled as the console port. And because there's only one within the configuration, it's going to be called console 0. If you remember that from the configuration I made on the last whiteboard when we were setting the password, I went into the line console 0 to make those changes. As I said earlier, this connector can be different, but regardless of the connector type, we're still going to run a cable from that console port over to a device, a computer normally, like our PC, and it's going to be connected to the back, and on the port that we're looking for on that computer is going to be the COM port, or the communications port. So the cable is going to extend between the 2 devices, and then we are able to configure the device via our computer. So here's our monitor and our keyboard, and we can make changes to that router. In addition to this physical connectivity that's offered by the cable, we're also going to need a piece of software that is called a terminal emulator. Now, these terminal emulators come in different software packages. In fact, in the Windows environment, you'll get one for free that comes with the different types of operating systems under Windows, and it is called Hyperterm. Now, Hyperterm can be used, or you can opt for a third party. I use Secure CRT, but either way, you're going to need a software package and this physical connectivity to gain access into the router. So let me show you how that works here. As I had said, I use Secure CRT. Once I'm in here, I'm going to opt for a quick connect. It's going to give me this menu box, and it's going to ask me what type of protocol do I wish to use to connect to the device. And this connection into the console port is known as a serial connection. I'm using a serial cable to get it done. I told you I can use the COM port for connectivity on my PC. I'm going to opt for COM1. You can use any COM port that's available within your PC. Now we're to the baud rate, the data bits, the parity, and the stop bits. The key here is I need 9600 as the baud rate, data bits set at 8, parity set at none, and the stop bits set to 1. So really the only change I need from the default is to change this to 9600 as far as these last 4 fields. At that point, I simply hit connect, and then I'll hit enter, and I'm into my device. In this case, it's the router that we were in earlier. Type the password, and there you go. I'm at the user exec mode. The next form of connectivity that we're going to cover is through the auxiliary port, also known as the aux port. Now, the aux port is going to be on the back of a router and can be represented as an RJ45 connection, and in fact, in most cases will, and it's going to be labeled as the aux port. This is used mainly for modem connectivity. In other words, I'm going to have a cable that runs from this aux port into a modem, and this modem is going to be connected into the plain old telephone system, POTS for short, because these are analog lines. In other words, I'm going to have a phone line and a phone number assigned to this modem, and so different devices out on the network or different telephones can be connected to PCs, and these PCs will have access into the configuration files on my router or my switch via this modem and the aux port. I also have virtual terminal connections. This type of connection is different than the other two in the fact that it doesn't have a dedicated physical connectivity as you would see here. This port is assigned strictly for the aux port. This port for the console port. What I'm going to have with my VTYs is I will have an Ethernet interface. Let's say I have an RJ45 connector here that connects this router into a local area network. And then from there, within this local area network, I have a PC here. Now this PC can connect to the router in its configuration files via these virtual terminal lines. And the reason they're called virtual is because obviously I'm not right on the terminal as I was here with the terminal emulator. So what I would do is I will use a telnet or SSH protocol to connect over the network into those devices. Again, this interface is not dedicated for this purpose because I will be passing and accepting data through this interface as a router normally should. I'm going to show you an example to illustrate the type of connectivity I'm talking about. I have a device, and it's the device that we're on now, that has an IP address of 192.168.1.254, and I also have a router that I'm going to connect to that is .2 on this same network, the 192.168.1. Now there are a number of remote connection type protocols that I can use to make this connection. Telnet and SSH are the most common. SSH is secure shell, so it's a secure version of Telnet. Telnet passes its password in a clear text. SSH uses encryption. What I'm going to do for this example is Telnet over this local area network and into that device. What I need to do to make that happen is bring up my command prompt. So I go to the run, hit OK here for command, and I simply type in my command telnet 192.168.1.2, and what I'm going to be given is a password prompt, and now I'm into router number 1 in the user exec mode. I can also advance into the privilege mode by simply typing in the enable command. Now that you have a solid understanding how to use each of these connectivity options, let's jump into the router and look at the configuration file to see where these lines fit within the router configuration. You see here that I'm at the privilege mode of my router. I am going to issue the command now, show configuration. Now don't worry that you're not familiar with these commands because they will be covered in other nuggets as we advance through this series. But for now, show configuration, I'm going to use the space bar to advance a page at a time. Now once I'm down to the bottom of this configuration, this is what I am concerned with. I have the different types of connectivity outlined, and they are all lines. So I have line, console 0, as we indicated here there was 1. There's one aux as well, so I have line, aux 0. Now here we're going to see another place where the VTYs differ from the other two types of connectivity. Line VTY, this stands for 0 through 4 because there are 5 distinct lines or virtual terminals that can be used for connectivity. And then also we're going to see session timeouts here and exec timeouts. The session timeout is how long in seconds a connection can be idle. In other words, no input into that connection before you're going to be disconnected. Then the exec timeout has to do with the time spent in the entire executive session. Remember, we have the user exec and privilege exec modes. This is how long you can be in those modes altogether. This is a total timeout. Also, we have passwords that can be assigned. Remember, we looked at that in our earlier whiteboard. We have to have the login command set and then the password as we want it defined, which in our case was Cisco. So far in this nugget, we've defined exactly what the iOS is. We've also looked at the user interface options, and now we just took a look at the connectivity types. Now we're going to go into the shortcut, then the help functions, and the editing. As far as shortcuts, really what we're talking about in this instance is command abbreviation. One of the few complaints I have with the command line interface is the fact that some of the configuration commands can get quite lengthy. As you see here, show configuration, configure terminal, line auxiliary. What Cisco IOS provides is a functionality where you can abbreviate those commands. In the case of show configuration, you can type in sh, then a space, CONF, and this will have the same effect as typing in the entire command. In fact, for configure terminal, you can type in CONF, so you can tell that conf is usually short for configure, and then T for terminal. With the line aux, you can simply type in line aux instead of line auxiliary, as you would see here. I have trouble even saying this word, much less typing it. So you can see that these can save you a great deal of time whenever you're configuring your router, especially in time of duress if you're troubleshooting your router. Let's get into our router so I can illustrate how this works. Here I have my router waiting. I am in the privilege mode, so I am going to issue the command sh CONF, which is short for show configuration. And as you can see, the same result comes out as if I had typed in the whole command. Then I want to move into the mode of configuring via terminal. So conf T, hit enter, and I'm in there. Let me go ahead while I'm in here and initiate line auxiliary configuration. So I'm going to use the line aux, and remember I have to identify the number, and there was only one number for the aux line, and that was 0. So line aux 0, hit enter, and my prompt changed to let me know that now I'm in the configuration of this specific type of line. There is one rule, however, associated with command abbreviation. As cool as it has a rule, and this is what it is. You have to provide enough letters that you guarantee to the iOS that you are identifying a unique command. In other words, the iOS doesn't want to have to make a decision between multiple commands. Let me give you an example. If I type in here show, or SH for show, and then CON, I leave off the F that I identified up here, I'm going to have a problem, and if I hit enter here, it's going to return an error message. Let me explain why. CONF would be short and unique for configuration, and then CONT would be short and unique for controllers. Two different functions in these commands, and the iOS gets lazy here and says, I'm not going to figure out which one you want, so I'm going to return an error. So you have to develop this up to the point that it is a unique command. The particular error message that you're going to receive when you type in show CON is called an ambiguous command error, and it's shown here. There's three types of error messages. First, the ambiguous command, next the incomplete command, and then the third is the invalid input, and then it gives you a hint here. I detected it at the marker. Let me take a trip into a router so I can give you examples of each of these types of error messages. First, I'm going to type in show con, as we talked about earlier, so you can see the return of the ambiguous command, and it tells you which command was ambiguous, as if you didn't know because it's right above. But anyway, that's the complete error. Now we're going to look at the incomplete command. I think it's really great that these error messages are very intuitive. There's really no guesswork. Here I had multiple choices for the iOS to decide between. Here, you're not done with the command yet, and in the end, invalid input. In other words, I have no idea what you're talking about. So let's see the incomplete command. I'm going to type in show space IP, a space, and then enter. And what it says is incomplete command. The reason is, if I type in show IP space and question mark, you'll see that there were a myriad of choices for me to go on with this command. In fact, there's so many, I had to space bar through them all. Let me back up on this because it wants to allow me to finish that command. The next error message we're going to look at is the invalid input. The command I'm going to use to show you that is show space root. Although this would probably be a good command for a Unix device, it is not a good command for an iOS device because there is no root within the iOS. These error messages are a form of help provided by the iOS to you as an administrator, but now let's talk about specifically the context-sensitive help function that is provided by the iOS. There's two types. First, there's help with developing words within your command structure, and then the next type of help is development of commands. And we're going to give you examples of each of these. Both of these functions utilize the question mark. It's just a matter of where they utilize it that makes the difference. So let me give you an example first in the context-sensitive help for finishing our word. If I type in the command sh space ro, no space here, and then a question mark, it's going to show me what is available as far as the beginnings of this command for a complete command. A look into our router will show you exactly why I chose this specific command to complete. Let me move this up a bit. If you remember, our error message showed us exactly where the invalid input started, and it was right here after the first O. So it must be saying that SHRO is the beginning of some valid command. This is where we're going to find out. SHRO question mark here, and it tells you route map is the option that would be a valid command. So show route map. Let me go ahead and space back over that, and let's discuss the ability to finish commands with this help function. The difference is, if we have a command, let's say conf here, now we're going to utilize a space and then the question mark. The iOS is going to return to us the options that are valid commands for conf space and then something else. Let's show that on the router. conf space question mark, and now it's going to return configure via memory, via network, overwrite the network, via terminal, which is what we've chosen so far within this nugget, or simply just return, which would be the terminal as well. The last section of this nugget has to do with the editing function within the iOS. Specifically, we're going to talk about the hotkeys available and also the history command. Let's start our discussion with the hotkeys. I need to pull up the router to do that. I'm going to lower this down a bit. And what we're going to do is give a platform command so that we can use these keys. And that command is going to be show IP route. All right, as you look at our hotkeys, Control A is going to take me to the beginning of the line. So let me hit that now. Control A, I started at the end of the line. Bam, there I am, the beginning of the line. Control E takes me to the end of the line. Now we're going to change up a little bit. We're using the escape character or button rather than the control. So let's see what the function would be here. Escape B is going to take me back. Oh, escape B is going to take me back one word. Escape F is going to take me forward one word. If you hold the escape down button down a little bit long, then you hear those beeps, so be careful of that. Also, now we're moving to the Control B, which is movement of characters. So Control B is one character, hit it again, there's another character. Control F will move me forward one character. Let me situate our router window now so that we can see the rest of these hotkeys and utilize them if we could. So I'm going to have to raise this up a second. All right, there we go. Let's get towards the middle of the command here. The next thing we have are the options of Control D that will delete one character or backspace. I opt for backspace every time. It's just simpler and easier to remember. So I'm going to backspace now, and you see that the R disappears. Let me put the R back in there for route. The next thing we need to cover is Control R, which is going to display or redisplay a line. So let's see that in action. I'm going to hit the Control and then the R button, and there you go. It simply takes the line you're on and the command you're in and redisplays it on a new line. I can't see much functionality for that, but there it is. All right, now we're on to Control U and Control W. These are the erase commands. One used to erase a line, another to erase an entire or just a word. So let's see that. I'm going to Control U now. And there goes my line up to the point that I had my marker. So it just deletes back everything that we had. So if I bring this out to the end of that line and then hit Control W, I'll delete that one word. Then the last two hotkeys available, the Control Z used to exit the configuration mode. We've used that many times. And then the Tab to complete partially entered commands. But this is interesting. The Tab can only be used once the command is known to be unique, because if there's multiple commands to choose from, like our show con or show con, then it can't finish the command because it doesn't know which one you want. So you've got to ask yourself, at the point that I have show conf and I know it's a unique command, why would I hit tab to finish out the command? Because of command abbreviation will still give me the same output. On to the next editing tool, and that is the history function. To utilize the history function, you use the arrow keys. If you use arrow up, which I'm going to do right now, it shows you the last command that you put in. You do it again, it shows you the command before that, and you can continue that for a period of time. If you use the down arrow, then you're going to progress in the other direction up to the point that you have a blank slate that you started with. And in fact, you can type in the command show history, and it's going to show you all the commands that you've initiated within the last n number of times. And you can set that parameter administratively as far as how many commands are going to be kept in history, and that's within the configuration mode. If you're like me, you're going to find yourself using the command recall portion of this history function, which is the up arrow, every time you're in a router. All right, in this nugget, we started out by defining exactly what the IOS is, and we defined it as a proprietary Cisco operating system that offered a high level of standards-based support. Then we identified the user interface, at least within routers, as being the command line interface, and within switches, either the CLI or a menu-driven type of configuration. There were three types of connectivity identified, and it was either connectivity via the console, the auxiliary port, or even the virtual terminal section, which we use Telnet or SSH type protocols to connect over the local area network. And then we got into the secrets of iOS navigation and what's going to make you an iOS Pro, and that is the shortcuts, which was command abbreviations, the help functions that could be either help to finish a word or help to finish a command, and then the editing, the hotkeys, and the history functionality as well. I hope this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.